When building workflows, it's important that you incorporate controls and validations throughout the design to ensure that it performs in line with expectations. Any checks or controls you want in place should be automated as much as possible, so that if anything goes wrong or doesn't work as expected, as a user, you are alerted accordingly. So let's picture the scenario. You're in charge of managing the results of a quiz game. You have previously created a workflow that works out the winning team, for which prize money is then handed out, so it's an important workflow. Now the workflow you've created looks something like this. You source the input data from the quiz night, which is sometimes handed to you in different formats, which you then union together. You then transpose the data so that it's in a long format. You then place a select tool after the transpose tool to rename a couple of the columns. There is then a small formula tool which allows some manual adjustments to be made to the scores if required. The final part of the workflow summarizes the dataset so that it groups by team and then sums the score. This generates the final result, which is then shown within the final browse tool. Now the quiz manager has been a little disappointed with this workflow recently for two reasons. Firstly, prize money was handed out to a team other than the blue or red team last week. In fact, it was handed out to a gold team, which was a fake submission. Unfortunately, the workflow didn't spot this new team. It is expected that players can only represent either the red team or the blue team. Secondly, the workflow has been accepting null data. It is expected that a question is either answered correctly and therefore obtains a value of 1, or is answered incorrectly and obtains a value of 0. So let's run the workflow and observe the result. As you can see, when we click on the final browse tool, we can see that, as per the manager's concerns, the gold team looks like it's won again. If I also click on the output anchor of the formula tool, you can see that Mike has a null value present in round 1, question 4. So with these two concerns in mind, let's implement some control checks to ensure they are captured accordingly. I first want to include a control which checks that there are no null records present within the column labelled score. If there is, it implies that the user didn't get the question wrong or didn't get the question right, which we know is impossible. This is a data quality issue we want to catch straight away, so let's implement this. So in order to do this, we can drag in what is known as the test tool, which can be found within the developer tool palette. So we can click on the plus icon and then add the developer tool palette accordingly. We can then drag the test tool after the final formula tool. To add a test, we can click on the add button within the configuration window. We can then provide the test a name. So we'll call our first test null records check. We can then state which input we are looking to perform the test on. Now, seeing as we have only connected one input source into the test tool, we only have one input to select. Now we can pick between 4 test options. We can perform a check that the records count matches a specific value. This is great if you have an expectation as to what the records count should be at specific points of a workflow. If the records count differs from the specific value that you stipulate, then an error will arise and will need to be rectified before continuing. The second option is where record count matches another input's record count. This ensures that there are no duplicates or data being filtered unexpectedly throughout your workflow. You would have to have a second input connected to this test tool in order to use this test. The third test option is where we check that an expression is true for all records. And the fourth check is where an expression is true for the first record. Now, when we are checking for null records, we want this to be done for all records. So in this example, we will select the third option. We then need to stipulate an expression. So I'll click on the little ellipsis on the right hand side, and then we can first of all take advantage of the various functions available in Alteryx. So to test for null values, I can scroll down to the test functions and we can use the one which states is null. I can then enter the incoming field called score in the parentheses. Now, because we're checking to see if the values coming through are not null, I will precede the function with an exclamation mark, which essentially turns this function into an is not null function. So in short, if a record in the incoming dataset has a null value in it, it will be flagged as false and an error would occur. Only when a record evaluates to false will an error arise. So let's run the workflow to see if we've captured the null value accordingly. When we run the workflow, you can see that we get an error appear within the test tool. And if we go to the results message window, you can see that we are being notified that the test null records check failed on record 4. If we now go to the incoming dataset and check record 4, we can see that this record does indeed have a null record, so we can now correct this accordingly. If I go back to the formula tool and change the conditional statement to apply a 1 to Mike's round 1 question 4, implying he got the question right, when we now rerun the workflow, the test has passed and we're now able to continue accordingly. Therefore now, I'm able to feel comfortable that whenever a null value appears in the score column at this point in the workflow, our test tool will capture this correctly. Great. Now you can have multiple tests within the same test tool if you're performing multiple tests on the incoming dataset or datasets. So we'll now address the second concern of management, that it should only be the red team or the blue team that should win the prize money. No other team should win. So we'll add a second test by clicking on the Add button, and this time we will call this test Team Check, which will make sure that each submission is either on the red team or the blue team. So in a similar way to the previous test, we'll make use of the test type expression is true for all records. We will then include a conditional statement that states if team equals red or team equals blue, then assign the boolean of 1, else assign 0, end if. 1 in this statement can be read as true and 0 can be read as false. With this check in place, we should get an error if ever there is a submission to a team other than the red or blue team. So let's run the workflow and observe the result. When we run the test, you can see that we get an error stating that the test team check failed on record 253. So if we go into the incoming dataset and scroll down to record 253, we can indeed see that this is where information pertaining to a gold team exists. So let's go to the start of the workflow where the new submission was unioned to the main dataset, and we can close the tool container so that it doesn't run, i.e. it won't be unioned. When we now run the workflow, we get no errors, meaning that the final result will show just red or blue and there will be no null values appearing in the score column. Great. So we've now added more control in our workflow to ensure it operates in line with expectation. Now there is a configuration option at the bottom which states don't report errors if there are other errors in the workflow. Now I usually like to have this deselected, as reporting errors in tests means you can look at them in parallel to resolving some of the other workflow errors, if there are any, but the option is up to you. Now obviously these two examples are tailored to this dataset and are controls you may want to put in place based on the management's feedback. But the types of controls will really depend on what your workflow is trying to achieve. So ask yourself, what should I be controlling at different parts of the workflow? How can I gain comfort that the workflow is producing the correct result every time? If I were to perform manual checks after the workflow, what would they be and how can I automate them using the test tool? Try creating a small workflow and create tests to make sure it's operating as you would expect it to. Now remember, if your test fails, i.e. it generates a false result, your workflow will create an error and you'll be notified where that error has occurred, which then enables you to investigate and correct the workflow accordingly. A very nice control feature, which is important in giving you, your stakeholders, and your organization comfort in your processes.